Fog drifted low across Mayfair, curling around the gas lamps like pale fingers reluctant to release the night. London stirred beneath it, carriages rumbling over wet cobblestones, shopkeepers lifting shutters, hawkers shouting the first gossip of the day. But beneath the ordinary clamor lay a tremor of something sharper, almost electric, as though the entire city had awakened eager to trade in a particular scandal. Newspapers snapped open with hungry hands. Parlors filled with murmurs. The Ton, with its polished shoes and sharpened tongues, had found a fresh story to devour. A marriage had been ordered, by the Crown itself. A union so mismatched, so unorthodox, that society struggled to decide whether to laugh or gasp. A dowager Duchess of 55, esteemed for her gravity and brilliance, was to wed a 20-year-old duke whose recent inheritance had only magnified his reckless habits. That such a woman should be tethered to a wayward youth seemed to many a punishment beyond dignity. That he should be shackled to one old enough to be his mother seemed poetic justice for a libertine. The Duchess of Wexley stepped from her carriage into this atmosphere of coiled whispers, her posture immaculate, her expression a serene mask honed through decades of careful endurance. She had survived a loveless marriage, managed estates larger than some counties, and buried a husband whose praise had always been reserved for accounts rather than affection. Yet as she crossed the marble threshold of Lady Harrowden's charity gathering, she felt the sting of something she had not permitted herself to feel in years: humiliation. It pricked her as she overheard two debutantes, their voices bright as broken glass, whisper behind their fans. "Imagine having to play nursemaid to a boy duke," one giggled. "She will rule him with ledgers instead of affection." The other smirked. Or perhaps he will simply ignore her and continue his amusements elsewhere. A breath caught lightly in the Duchess's chest, not enough to be seen, but enough to remind her that she was human beneath all the marble dignity. Elsewhere in London, the young Duke of Marrowwood leaned over a gambling table in a dim hall thick with smoke and stale laughter. Coins clattered, cards slapped, and half-drunk cheers rose as he lost his final hand of the evening. His expression did not flicker. He seemed to wear recklessness not as pleasure but as armor. When his guardians forced their way into the hall, their disapproval was nothing new. But tonight their anger bore weight. They presented him with the Crown's mandate. He was to marry the widowed Duchess of Wexley immediately. If he refused, the estate would be placed under stewardship, and his title, though not stripped, would become a hollow shell. He stared at the parchment as though it were a joke written in cruel handwriting. "She is 55, he said quietly. "And I am not," one guardian replied bluntly. "You have disgraced your lineage. She is the only one capable of restoring it." For a fleeting moment, something raw flickered in his eyes, fear perhaps or weariness, but he hid it beneath a lazy grin. "Very well," he replied. "If they wish to punish me with a wife, I shall bear it." Their meeting took place the next morning in the Duchess's townhouse, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and dust motes drifted like suspended time. She stood when he entered, offering a curtsy imbued with impeccable grace, though her heart trembled beneath the silk. He bowed, his edges roughened by cynicism, yet softened unexpectedly by youth. For a moment, their gazes met, hers steady, his strangely searching. Then both retreated into formality. They spoke politely, yet their words never touched the truth. She believed she had been summoned not as a bride, but as a guardian of his future, a final act of duty demanded by the Crown. He believed she had been chosen as a punishment, a noble woman whose competence would smother him. Their misunderstandings, vast and quiet as the sea, stretched between them like a third presence in the room. The betrothal contract lay upon the table, its ink still fresh. She read it with calm resignation. He signed it with outward nonchalance, though his hand trembled faintly before he steadied it. That tremor did not escape her. It hinted at something beneath the arrogance, something like vulnerability. She looked at him, not at the notorious rake, not at the petulant youth, but at a young man thrust into a role he never learned to carry. Yet even as she sensed this, she felt the weight of the Ton's judgment settling onto her shoulders. She would become the subject of caricatures, whispers, cruel speculations. Her dignity would serve as London's entertainment. After their brief, stilted conversation, he offered to escort her to the carriage waiting outside. Rain had begun to fall, drumming softly against the windows. When she hesitated at the doorway, He lifted the umbrella without a word, shielding her from the downpour as though instinct guided him rather than courtesy. The gesture was small, barely more than a reflex, but it unsettled her more deeply than any insult could have. For a heartbeat, she glimpsed the man he might have been before excess hollowed him. A man capable of gentleness, if only someone had taught him it was allowed. They reached the carriage in silence. She stepped in, gathering her skirts, and he paused as though weighing something he wished to say but dared not. Instead, he simply nodded. The door closed. The horses lurched forward. London blurred beyond the rain-streaked glass. The Duchess inhaled slowly, letting the scent of wet earth and old leather ground her. She had endured many roles, but this forced marriage to a boy duke, felt like a cruel rewriting of her life's final chapters. Yet beneath the shame, something unexpected stirred, faint but undeniable: curiosity. She had seen fear in his hand, softness in his gesture, conflict in his eyes. Perhaps he was not merely the city's cautionary tale. Back inside the townhouse, the young duke remained beneath the rain, watching the carriage disappear. Drops clung to his hair, slid down his jaw, mingled with breath he exhaled in a long, unguarded sigh. He looked down at his hand, the one that had trembled, and flexed it as if attempting to understand the betrayal. Then he whispered something only the rain heard. She deserved better than this. It was not quite remorse, not quite fear, but something far more dangerous for a man who had never been allowed to feel deeply. And as the narrator would later note, this was the moment neither of them recognized the truth. The punishment the crown intended would become the thing that undid them both, and rebuilt them in ways neither yet dared imagine. The wedding took place on a gray morning that seemed unwilling to brighten, as though the sky itself disapproved. The chapel, though beautifully paneled in oak and lit by tall beeswax candles, felt hollow. Only a scatter of required witnesses attended, each wearing an expression of disciplined curiosity. The Duchess walked down the aisle with a composure so pristine it bordered on fragile. Her gown, a soft ivory silk, whispered against the stone floor, but no murmur of admiration followed her. People watched her as one might watch an instrument of correction being fitted to a wayward pupil. The young duke waited at the altar, looking neither rebellious nor resigned, only distant, as though the ceremony were happening behind a pane of glass. Their vows were spoken clearly, but emotionless, like lines both had memorized for a play neither wished to perform. When the rector pronounced them husband and wife, a quiet rustle passed through the chapel, the sound of a society recalibrating its expectations. She lowered her gaze to avoid the pity glinting in a dowager's eyes. He tightened his jaw when he overheard a baronet mutter, "A neat little trap for the boy." Their carriage ride to the ancestral estate stretched long between them, filled with the rhythmic beat of hooves and an unspoken tension that seemed to pulse with each mile. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles whitened. He glanced at her once, then again, as though trying to decipher her thoughts but fearing the answer. Outside, the countryside unfurled in gentle hills, mist-kissed and hushed, a welcome contrast to the biting gossip of London. Yet inside the carriage, silence pressed in like a third passenger, unwelcome, insistent, shaping their every breath. When they arrived at Marrowwood Hall, the staff assembled to greet them, forming a respectful line beneath the great stone arch. Some looked at the Duke with apprehension, recalling months of reckless unpredictability. Others regarded the Duchess with cautious hope. She stepped forward first, greeting each servant by name, astonishing them, for she had studied the estate records thoroughly before arriving. Her voice carried the authority of experience, but softened with a warmth they did not expect. By the time she crossed the threshold, the tone of the household had altered. Quiet admiration replaced uncertainty. The young Duke noticed it too, and something flickered across his face, perhaps envy, perhaps relief. Inside, she wandered the grand corridors, observing the disarray left by months of neglect. Ledgers were incomplete, correspondence unanswered, tenant reports unopened. She moved through the estate like a steward reclaiming a sinking ship, her mind sharpening with purpose. The Duke watched her from the doorway of the study, leaning against the frame with arms loosely crossed, as she began sorting stacks of letters. "You know," he said lightly, "they expect you to whip me into shape." She didn't look up. "Do you wish to be shaped?" He blinked, caught unprepared by her calm directness. I suppose I wish to be understood," he said finally. She paused, but only for a heartbeat. "Then begin there," she murmured, returning to her work. That evening, as she reviewed the estate accounts by candlelight, she heard a soft knock. Outside her chamber, placed on a small silver tray, lay a velvet box. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a quill, silver, expertly forged, elegant without excess. Not a jewel, not a frivolity, but a tool of leadership. A symbol of partnership, or at least acknowledgement. She lifted it with careful fingers, feeling the unexpected weight of the gesture. For the first time since the marriage had been decreed, something warm flickered beneath her ribs. Not affection, not yet, but possibility. However, the morning papers shattered that fragile warmth. A caricature dominated the front page, a grotesquely exaggerated drawing of her towering over the Duke, portrayed as a trembling child. The title read, "A Duke Disciplined, London's Newest Comedy." She couldn't finish reading. Rage did not claim her. Only a familiar ache, sharp and deep, the ache of becoming entertainment for those who never understood her worth. She retreated into her room, her breath catching as though the walls had tightened around her. Downstairs, the Duke discovered the caricature abandoned on the foyer table. Something in him ignited, a spark far fiercer than embarrassment. He stormed out without informing anyone, riding hard into the city. The publisher, a plump man with a self-satisfied smirk, looked up in surprise when the Duke entered, drenched from rain and radiating fury. Without raising his voice, the Duke laid the paper on the desk. "You may mock me," he said, each word low and steady, "but you will not dishonor my wife." The publisher's smirk faltered. The Duke tore the caricature in half, then again, and left the pieces scattered like ash before striding out into the rain. When he returned to Marrowwood Hall, soaked to the bone, he found the Duchess standing in the corridor outside her chamber, the torn caricature now resting in the hearth of the small sitting-room nearby. She looked at him, not with gratitude, not with pity, but with something searching, hesitant, almost tender. The firelight cast a warm glow across her face, softening the sharp lines grief and age had carved. "You should not have troubled yourself," she said quietly. He removed his wet gloves slowly. "It was no trouble," he replied. "No one shames you in my presence." Her breath trembled. She turned toward the fire, gazing at the fragments curling into embers. He watched the fragile rise and fall of her shoulders, wondering how a woman so composed could still bleed beneath her dignity. "London will not relent," she whispered. "They never do." He took one slow step toward her. "Then let us face them together." She did not answer, but her fingers brushed the silver quill on the mantel as though acknowledging an unspoken pact forming between them. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as if marking the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. And in that flickering firelight, as the last scrap of the cruel caricature turned to ash, he realized with a jolt that he no longer saw her as the punishment the crown intended, but as the first person in years who made him wonder what sort of man he might become. Rain softened the world that evening, blurring the edges of Marrowwood Hall until it seemed suspended between past and present. Inside, the Duchess moved through the dimly lit corridors with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to solitude, though something in her carriage had shifted since the morning. The brittle dignity she wore like armor had thinned. She paused outside the drawing-room, hearing the low murmur of the Duke's voice. He was speaking to the steward, discussing repairs, tenant arrears, and overdue correspondence with a seriousness that surprised her. When she stepped inside, he straightened at once, as though caught in an act of rare virtue. His hair, still damp from the rain, glistened in the candlelight. "I did not know you were awake," he said. She offered a faint smile. "I did not know you were working." His lips curved in something between humor and humility. "Neither did I." The steward departed, leaving them alone in the soft glow of the hearth. Silence, at first awkward, soon settled into something contemplative. The Duke leaned his elbow on the mantel, watching the flames. "I have been thinking," he began slowly, "that perhaps I have allowed the world to define me before I ever attempted to define myself." She studied him, noting the sincerity beneath his uncertainty. "And what definition would you prefer?" His gaze flicked toward her. "One that would not shame you." The words, spoken without flourish, struck her with unexpected force. She clasped her hands to keep them steady. "You do not embarrass me," she replied quietly. "The world embarrasses itself." He looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether he deserved such grace. Later, when supper was brought, they ate together for the first time since their wedding, not out of obligation, but because neither suggested otherwise. The table, usually imposing with its long stretch of polished wood, felt smaller with the lamps casting a warm pool of light around them. Their conversation wandered tentatively. His childhood tutors, her years managing the Wexley estates, the loneliness that crept into both of their lives long before their unexpected union. With each shared truth, something deeper formed, a fragile bridge built not of affection, but of understanding. At one point, when she laughed softly at a story he told about a runaway horse, he blinked as if startled by the sound. "You should do that more often," he murmured. She lowered her gaze, flustered by the gentle admiration in his tone. "It is not a habit," she said. "Perhaps it should become one," he whispered. As night deepened, thunder rumbled across the hills. The Duchess walked toward the library, intent on finishing her review of the tenant contracts, when a sharp crack of lightning plunged the corridor into darkness. She inhaled sharply, steadying herself against the wall. The Duke found her moments later, carrying a lantern whose amber glow wrapped them in a small circle of light. "You are not afraid of storms, are you?" he asked softly. She hesitated. Not the storm itself. Merely memories of nights spent waiting for a husband who never returned before dawn. Understanding passed over his features, quiet, solemn, unspoken. He lifted the lantern slightly. "Then allow me to give you better memories." They reached the library, where firelight flickered across shelves lined with centuries of knowledge. The warmth of the room invited a vulnerable kind of stillness. She settled at the writing desk, spreading the contracts before her, but her attention was drawn to the Duke pacing thoughtfully near the window. "Why do you linger?" she asked, trying for lightness though her pulse quickened. He looked over his shoulder, his expression unguarded. "Because I would like to speak with you. Properly." The earnestness in his tone startled her more than the lightning had. She folded her hands atop the parchment and nodded for him to continue. He approached slowly, as though nearing a fragile truth. "I have been reckless, yes, but not out of delight. Out of emptiness." His voice dropped to a darker register. "Since inheriting the title, I have worn responsibility like a noose, not a privilege. I feared failing, feared not being enough. So I behaved as though nothing mattered." Her breath tightened. She knew that fear intimately, decades of perfection demanded by a society that rewarded her competence yet dismissed her personhood. "And now?" she asked gently. He exhaled, long and trembling. "Now I find myself married to a woman who sees everything I have tried to hide." She felt the words like a hand pressed softly against her heart. "I do not judge you," she whispered. "I have lived long enough to know that people become what the world teaches them to be." He stepped closer, shadows shifting across the planes of his face. "Then teach me differently," he said, quietly, not as a command, but as a plea. Her pulse quickened, not with romantic fluttering, but with the heavy weight of a responsibility she had never anticipated. "I can guide you," she answered, "but I cannot shape you. That must come from within." His gaze held hers, steady and raw. "Then I will try." The rain hammered harder against the windows, a wild rhythm that made the lantern flame waver. In that flickering half-light, he reached out, not boldly, not presumptuously, but hesitantly, and brushed his fingertips against the back of her hand. She stiffened, startled, not by the touch itself but by the gentleness of it. He withdrew instantly. "Forgive me," he murmured. She shook her head slowly. "Do not apologize for kindness." A silence followed, threaded with emotions neither knew how to name. She rose to return to her chamber, gathering her shawl with composed grace, but as she passed him, he spoke softly, so softly she almost missed it over the storm. "For what it is worth," he said, "I never imagined marriage would feel less like a sentence and more like a beginning." She paused, her fingers tightening around the shawl's edge. The The words lingered in the air like a fragile offering. She turned slightly, seeing him not as the reckless youth London mocked, nor as the burden the crown had assigned her, but as a man searching desperately for a place where he might be more than his failures. "Beginnings," she whispered, "are rarely recognized until long after they have begun." His breath caught, and as she stepped into the corridor, lantern light spilling at her feet, neither realized that the first true fissure had opened in the wall both had built, one that would change far more than either dared imagine. Spring unfurled slowly across Marrowwood, softening the earth and coaxing pale blossoms from still shivering branches. The Duchess walked through the rose garden that morning, her shawl brushing lightly against the new buds, her thoughts lingering on the previous night's confession, a confession that had unsettled the careful stillness she had maintained for years. The young Duke joined her without announcement, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He carried a ledger under his arm, worn from study. "I thought," he said gently, "that you might walk with me while we review the accounts. I learn better in motion." She arched a brow, amused despite herself. "Or you avoid sitting still." He smiled, an unguarded, earnest smile that made him look suddenly younger and yet unexpectedly sincere. "That too," he admitted. They strolled beneath the trembling light, discussing tenant repairs and spring plantings, their conversation weaving effortlessly between duty and something far more intimate. She noticed how he listened now, truly listened, not merely to please her, but to understand. He noticed how her eyes softened when she spoke of the land, how her voice, often reserved, warmed when she spoke of stewardship. In those small exchanges, something shifted, subtle yet momentous. Affection began to seep into the spaces previously filled only with obligation. The shift became undeniable at their first formal outing as husband and wife. They attended a London ball, a spectacle of chandeliers, silk, and barely concealed curiosity. Whispers preceded their entrance, a rustling wave of judgment. He felt those whispers like nettles, each one a reminder of who he had been. She felt them like old ghosts returning. Yet when the music began, he crossed the ballroom toward her with a steady confidence that quieted the room. Younger ladies watched him expectantly, but he passed them all, stopping before his wife with a bow that was almost reverent. "Will you grant me this dance?" The question, simple though it was, struck through the long history of what others expected from both of them. She hesitated, not from reluctance but from emotion rising too swiftly. "Are you certain?" she whispered. His gaze held hers. "I have never been more certain of anything." When she placed her hand in his, the ballroom erupted into hushed astonishment. As he led her onto the floor, his hand settled respectfully yet protectively at her waist. They moved together with a harmony neither had anticipated, her grace meeting his eagerness, his warmth softening her restraint. For the length of that dance, gossip fell away. The world faded. They were simply two souls discovering a rhythm they had not expected to share. After the dance, they stepped onto the balcony to breathe. Cool night air wrapped around them, scented with spring blossoms from the courtyard below. She rested her hands on the stone railing, steadying herself. "You need not make a spectacle of kindness for my sake," she murmured. "It invites cruelty." He leaned beside her, the proximity warm but respectful. "I did not dance with you to silence them," he said. "I danced with you because I wished to." She turned her face toward him, the soft moonlight catching the silver at her temples. "You risk much." His expression gentled. "You risk more. And you have risked it alone for far too long." They remained there, their breaths mingling in the cool air, until carriages began to depart and whispers once again swelled inside the ballroom. The Duke escorted her to the carriage, offering his hand not as formality but as devotion. She accepted it with a gratitude she did not speak aloud. In the days that followed, warmth settled into the household like a newly invited guest. They shared breakfasts, walked the grounds together, discussed letters late into the evening. The staff observed the growing ease between them and whispered their own quiet hopes. Even she could no longer deny the fragile joy blooming in her chest. Yet joy, she knew, often invited its own dangers. It arrived in the form of a rumor, petty, cruel, and perfectly timed. An old gambling companion of the Duke, embittered by his reforms and sudden disinterest in reckless pleasures, whispered through London that the Duchess controlled him like a puppet. that she kept him on a short leash, that he had traded his youth for her wealth, and she wielded him as a trophy of victory over vice. The words traveled with vicious speed. The Duchess found out one morning when an anonymous letter arrived, the ink sharp as venom. "Your leash on him will fray soon enough." She read it in silence, her face paling. When the Duke entered the room moments later, her expression had shuttered into the old, cold composure she had worn for decades. He noticed instantly. "What has happened?" he asked. She handed him the letter without a word. His jaw tightened. "This is filth," he said. "And a lie." But she stepped away. "It does not matter. The world believes what it wishes." Her voice trembled despite her control. He reached for her arm, gentle, earnest. "Look at me." She did, but her eyes held an old pain he had not been meant to see. "I will not be the reason you are mocked again," she whispered. "Your reputation is still fragile." He shook his head, emotion rising hot beneath his frustration. "I do not care for their opinions." She turned away, shoulders rigid. "But I do." The distance between them grew in that instant, like a door closing softly. He stepped back, grief flickering across his features. She moved toward the window, staring at the early spring rain streaking the glass. "I have lived long enough to know how quickly affection becomes ammunition," she said softly. "I cannot bear to see you wounded because of me." Her words were a plea, though she disguised them as wisdom. He crossed the room slowly, refusing to let the distance harden. When he reached her, he bowed his head, not in defeat but in devotion, and knelt before her. Kneeling, he looked up with steady, earnest eyes. "If the world misjudges me, I bear it," he said quietly. "But if they misjudge you, I will not rest." Her breath caught, the air thick with unspoken longing. She stared at him, stunned by the sincerity that radiated from him. Raw, unguarded, entirely real. The storm outside darkened the sky, but the moment between them burned bright, fragile as flame. And as the wind rattled the windows, she realized with a shiver that the true danger was no longer society's judgment. It was how deeply she was beginning to feel for him, despite every warning she had given herself. The storm that had been gathering over Marrowwood through the long night finally broke at dawn, casting the estate in a pale, trembling light. The Duchess stood at her window, fingers pressed into the sill as if anchoring herself against a world that insisted on reshaping her life without permission. The Duke's words from the night before echoed inside her. "If they misjudge you, I will not rest." They had pierced her with unsettling clarity, a promise spoken not in youthful bravado but in a sincerity she had never expected from him. Yet sincerity, she knew too well, could become its own danger. Too easily it made the heart betray its own caution. Downstairs, the Duke paced the study like a man preparing for battle. His jaw was set, his breath tight, and yet beneath the simmering anger lay something gentler, fear. Not fear of society, nor of scandal, but of losing the fragile connection blossoming between them. The rumor spread about her was more than a petty cruelty. It was an attempt to drag her back into the shadows of mockery he had only just begun to pull her from. He could not allow that. Not now. Not ever. When she entered the room, he stopped mid-stride. She looked composed, as always, but her composure now felt like a shield hastily raised. "You should not concern yourself with this further," she said before he could speak. "The matter will fade." He shook his head. "Matters only fade when left to those who thrive on whispers. I won't leave your honor to their mercy." She exhaled sharply. "And if you defy them publicly, they will only intensify their attacks." He stepped closer. "Let them. I am no longer the boy they mock. And you are no woman to be diminished." The steward interrupted with a hesitant knock. "Your Grace," he said to the Duke, "Lord Weatherly has arrived. He claims urgency." The Duchess flinched. Weatherly was the very man who had whispered the poison now swirling through London. The Duke's expression hardened. "Bring him to the west parlor." As the steward retreated, the Duchess caught the Duke's arm. "Do not act rashly." He lifted her hand, holding it with surprising steadiness. "I will act rightly." The west parlor, with its tall windows overlooking the rain-swept lawns, became the stage for a confrontation London would never witness yet would feel the ripples of for years. Lord Weatherly lounged on the settee, twirling his gloves with feigned ease. When the Duke entered, followed by the Duchess, Weatherly rose with a mocking bow. "Your Graces, I trust the morning finds you well." The Duke stepped forward with a calm so controlled it hummed with power. "You are here," he said, "because you have spoken lies." Weatherly's laugh was light, careless. "Lies? No, no. Observations. The ton simply enjoys a good spectacle." The Duke's voice dropped. "Then let this be one." He motioned to the steward, who carried in a stack of letters, contracts, records, everything demonstrating the Duke's reforms, his renewed stewardship, his partnership with his wife in restoring the estate. The documents thudded onto the table between them. "You spread rumors," the Duke continued, "suggesting I am a puppet. Yet these records show progress you insisted I was incapable of." Weatherly's smile faltered. "Paper can be arranged to say anything." The Duke leaned in, eyes cold. "Then hear it from me. I stand beside my wife because she is the only person who believed I could be more than what I was. And I will not allow you, or anyone, to use her dignity as your amusement." Weatherly swallowed. The Duchess watched, breath unsteady, her heart tightening at the force of the Duke's defense. Not theatrical, not blustering, but grounded in conviction. The silence stretched. At last, Weatherly muttered something about misunderstandings and excused himself with stiff courtesy. The moment he was gone, the Duke released a breath as though unclenching a long-held fear. The Duchess approached him slowly. "You should not have," he turned sharply. "Do not finish that sentence." His eyes held a burning depth she had not yet seen, something fierce yet tender. "You think I defend you out of obligation. I do not. I do it because—" His voice broke slightly, like a boy's before he found the shape of his truth. "Because you matter to me." Her breath caught. "I am old enough to be your mother," she whispered. "And yet you look at me as though youth were not a prerequisite for affection." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "Affection has never followed rules, least of all societies. You taught me that dignity is a choice, not an inheritance. You taught me that leadership is quieter than arrogance. And you taught me—" His throat tightened. "You taught me that I was capable of being more than my failures." She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, as though steadying something inside her threatening to spill over. "I was not meant to be loved again," she whispered, "nor to inspire it." He reached for her hand, not commanding, not assuming, but offering. "Perhaps you were meant to be cherished in ways you were denied before." She closed her eyes, the weight of years softening under the unexpected warmth rising between them. "What do you want of me?" she asked, voice nearly breaking. "Nothing," he said. "Only the chance to earn whatever you choose to give." She stood very still, hearing the rain soften against the windows, feeling the careful calm of the moment settle around them like a fragile veil. She opened her eyes and held his steady gaze. "And if I cannot give what you seek?" He smiled gently. "Then I will be grateful for whatever you offer." Silence unfurled, rich and trembling. He lifted her hand, brushing his lips against it, a gesture more reverent than romantic, a vow disguised as courtesy. She felt the warmth linger long after his lips withdrew. Her pulse fluttered with a tenderness she had not permitted herself to feel in decades. "You risk much," she murmured. "I risk more," he replied softly. "But for once, the risk feels worth the fall." A knock on the door broke the spell. The steward entered, holding a sealed letter, royal stationery. The Duchess's heart dipped. "From London." The steward bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." Marked urgent. The Duke took the letter, exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with her, and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the page, slowly at first, then with growing tension. The Duchess stepped closer, searching his face. "What does it say?" He looked up, breath unsteady, color rising faintly in his cheeks, not from fear, but from something sharper. "It seems," he said quietly, "that the Crown plans to summon us to London." She stared at him, feeling the air thin between them. "They wish," he continued, "to question the legitimacy of our marriage." And in the stillness that followed, her world tilted, just slightly, just enough to feel the coming storm gather around them once more.